Hey everyone, welcome back from the Ground Up Sit and Goes. Today's going to be the first lesson of module number 4, which is going to be a module all about late game play, and more specifically, something I'm sure a lot of you have been waiting for, considering this is an intro to Sit and Go course. This is going to be the very ICM intensive lesson. Something like sort of an issue I ran into sort of constructing this module was that the thing about sit and goes, or creating a sit and go course like this, is it's not like an MPT course where I could just pick some generic top heavy structure and spend the bulk of the time just talking about situations that come up in that structure, and just sort of running scenarios for it, blah, blah, blah. The thing about sit and goes is you have stuff like 18-man sit and goes, you have stuff like 6-max sit and goes, you have stuff like on-demand sit and goes or MTT sit and goes, that all have like pretty dramatically different ICM structures. You have like very flat structures, you have very top heavy, you have sort of in between. And because of that, I sort of determined that the most efficient way to go about making this section of the course was to focus more on like general strategic principles that are going to be helpful regardless of the sit and go format that you pursue. So sort of like ICM concepts that span across different formats. And so as a result of that, the way that this module is structured is that this first lesson, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's entitled Your ICM Toolkit. And then in subsequent lessons in this module, there's 4 more lessons after this one. And in each lesson, I'm going to present 2 sort of like general strategic ICM related principles. And then I'm going to either use spreadsheets or use ICMizer and go through a few examples that illustrate the point I'm trying to make so that you can see it in practice, and hopefully just sort of drive home the point that I am making in that lesson. All right, so let's jump into the first lesson of module number 4, and it is entitled Your ICM Toolkit. So in my eyes, Your ICM Toolkit is going to have 2 main items. Obviously, there are more items than just those 2, but these are going to be the 2, like the biggest ones, the most important tools. The first of which is going to be the one you are going to spend 97% of your study using, and that is an ICM calculator. And the second tool is going to be, it's a bit less intuitive than the first, but it is going to be the sort of big picture overarching concepts that you use to understand the results you are seeing in your ICM calculator. So when it comes to the first tool in your toolkit, your calculator, you basically are going to be choosing between 2 options. The first of those options is the industry leader and one you've probably heard of before. It's called ICMizer. And the second one, a bit lesser known, but one that's been around a while, one that I use because I'm a poker dinosaur, and because I hate change, and that is Hold'em Resources Calculator, also known as HRC. In terms of what the programs or the calculators themselves are capable of, very similar things. Doesn't really matter, in my opinion. Pretty much a negligible difference. ICMizer looks a bit better. I think Hold'em Resources Calculator has a couple of cool features that ICMizer doesn't, but it's really just not that important. With all of that said, I'm going to recommend ICMizer to you guys, and there's a couple of reasons. One, I think it's better to look at by far, but I think it's mostly because of the extra features, and the first of those extra features is the sit and go coach feature. So the thing about studying ICM is that ultimately it involves a lot of brute force work, or at least it did before sit and go coach. And that's because you sort of, in my opinion, the best way to go about studying ICM is to sort of set up different stack distributions for whatever format you're playing and just sort of hammering them out over and over again and getting an idea of what is happening in what distribution, why that's happening, et cetera, et cetera. Sit and go coach sort of like expedites that entire process. It's a push-pull trainer, and it's highly customizable. So you can basically choose like the number of people that are left in your sit and go, the format of sit and go you're playing. You get to choose whether you're shoving in the spot or calling in the spot. So i.e. what are you being tested on? And you get to choose your stack size, whether you have a short stack, a medium stack, or a big stack. And on top of this, it has a bunch of cool things, like it also has a leaderboard. So you get like quiz, you get a score, you go on a leaderboard, you try to climb that leaderboard. So you have like some incentives to get good at whatever you're doing, not just based on the money you could be winning at the tables, but you could be crushing these leaderboards. And another really cool feature is that they actually have a mobile app for Sit and Go Coach. So you can be practicing your sit and go spots. You're be doing push fold training when you're on the bus or in the car or commuting or whatever it is. So that's pretty awesome. And that's definitely something that HRC does not have. And then the other thing is that it has a bubble factor feature. And we're going to talk a bit about this later, but it's basically like a visualization that is going to give you a better intuitive feel about what spots in sit and goes the ICM is particularly heavy in, and which spots maybe they're it's a bit less restrictive. So in terms of pricing for ICMizer, it isn't cheap for sure. It's $17.99 a month which is like a subscription model for just the calculator. That does not include Sit and Go Coach. Sit and Go Coach is only included in ICMizer Pro, and it's $32.99 a month. Now, I know that's pretty steep, especially for people that are mostly going to be playing micro and low stakes sit and goes. But I would say that, as with anything in life, the time you spend in the beginning with this program the rate of like improvement and of knowledge acquisition is going to far surpass like future months you spend with this program. So if you spend a month or two going really hard with this program, I think you're definitely going to get your money's worth. And then after that, you can revert to just the $17.99 for the calculator, or you can come to the dark side and come to my side of things and come to Hold'em Resources Calculator, which is only $10 a month, which I think is a lot more manageable than $33 a month US. So making sense of calculator outputs. In my experience, I've found the most efficient way of learning with calculators, and this is through a lot of trial and error, is that you have to avoid the memorization trap. You have to avoid like looking at a spot and being like, okay, I call ace 2 suited here and ace 5 offsuit and king 7 suited and blah, blah, blah. And the reason that you need to avoid that, it's good to have like a general idea. But number one, as we mentioned in the first module, ICM is not that exact. It's not definitely the answer. So you could be, if you're getting into the memorization trap, you're trying to memorize something that might not even be accurate or might not even be correct. So obviously that's one issue. But the second issue is that I've found when it comes to stuff like this, it is more helpful for me to sort of view it on like sort of zoom out and view it more big picture and try to understand why the ranges look the way they do, and realize that the ranges follow like very similar patterns in different spots, and just trying not to memorize the exact grid or the exact hands that I'm seeing that I'm allowed to call on a spot or that I'm allowed to shove, but sort of note the patterns and note why those hands are going there. It's a lot like reading a Pio grid, to be honest. And yeah, I've just found that sort of trying to explain why the answer I'm looking at looks the way it does is a lot more efficient for me in terms of learning and in terms of like applying what I've learned at the tables than facing a spot at the table and being like, oh, I looked at a sim just like this the other day. What was the range that I called? Like, I don't find that helpful. I think that sort of defeats the purpose. I think it's like cramming for a test the night before and then just forgetting everything a few days later. So that's why I think these big picture concepts are better for learning, and that's what we're going to focus on here in the rest of this lesson. So here are a few of the big picture concepts that I have found helpful in my own ICM study that hopefully you will as well. All right, so the first of these concepts is going to be a bubble factor, which is also something I mentioned on the previous slide, and is sort of a visual component of ICMizer, very helpful component. And it's used to gauge the equity required to make a plus dollar EV call off facing a shove versus different stacks at the table, which is basically giving us this, it's basically allowing us to evaluate how strong the ICM is in a particular spot. It's displayed as a number between 1 and 3-ish, or approximately 1, approximately 3, where 1 is a spot with very low or negligible ICM effects, and 3 is a spot that requires 75% equity to make a plus dollar EV call off, i.e. it is a spot with very heavy ICM. So basically, the higher the bubble factor, the greater the premium, the sort of sort of like equity premium, or the greater the threshold in terms of like chips required for you to make a plus dollar EV call off. Basically, just like the higher the bubble factor, the more chips you need to be making before you start making money. It's probably the best way to sum it up. There are lots of spots that come up in ICM spots, and very heavy ICM spots, where you are just folding hands that are making more than a big blind calling off, which is pretty wild, even when you have like 8 big blinds or 7 big blinds. ICM, man, very fun. The bubble factor formula is simply the change in our stack's equity if we call and lose, divided by the change in our stack's equity if we call and win. Since like chip values are not linear in terms of like win and loss, it's like in terms of if we're comparing winning 100 chips to losing 100 chips, it has a greater negative effect that losing the 100 chips than the positive effect of winning the 100 chips. So basically in a spot like this, if we have change in the stack's equity if we lose on top and equity if we win on the bottom, what's going to happen is that's going to result in a positive integer. And that's why the bubble factor tends to be represented as a number between 1 and 3-ish. If we want to use the bubble factor to sort of get a rough equity estimate for where that like threshold is for making a plus dollar EV call, we simply take the bubble factor and divide it by the bubble factor plus 1, multiply it by 100, and you get an equity percentage, which you are going to see in ICMizer in a second here. And then we have a link at the bottom here. This is just if you want to read more about the bubble factor, how it's calculated, see some examples of it in action. Highly recommend checking that out. All right, so the second concept we're going to talk about today is ICM priority. And this is very much related to bubble factor. And it's concept used to highlight that the impact of winning or losing a set number of chips on our stack's EV will differ depending on who at the table those chips were won or lost. So it does matter who our opponent is that we are gaining or losing chips versus in terms of the effect or the magnitude of the effect on our underlying stack's EV. I.e., we are more incentivized to collide with certain stacks at the table or more disincentivized to collide with certain stacks at the table than we are with others. So I think the best way to demonstrate ICM priority and bubble factor is actually just to go into ICM and give you an example. All right, so I've already got this set up. This is going to be for it's 3-handed spot in a 6-max sit and go. So the payouts are going to be 65% to first place and 35% to second. Third place gets 0%. As you can see here, we have a 50 big blind stack on the button, a 15 big blind stack in the small blind, and the big blind has a stack of 10 big blinds. Just before we even run this hand, let's just take a look at the EVs. Well, actually, first thing I want to do here is show you the bubble factor. So if I run this spot, looks like I already have. In terms of the bubble factor in this spot, if it says hero here, but if the button folds and it's folded to the small blind is going to jam 64% of hands, these hands right here. And the big blind is going to call 38% of the time with these hands right here. The bubble factor is these numbers right here, and you're going to see they're going to change based on where the stacks are. But in this spot, if we just hover over the big blind here, it says that the big blind bubble factor versus the small blind is 1.1. And the big blind needs 52.3% raw equity to call a small blind push. If we think back to the bubble factor equation in terms of like how we quickly figure out how much equity we need in a spot, if the bubble factor is going to be 1.1, what we do is take the bubble factor and we divide that by the bubble factor plus 1. So in this case, it would just be 2.1. We times that by 100 and we get 52.3. And as we can see here, we needed 52.3% raw equity to make a plus dollar EV call off. Something else with the bubble factor here is that if you just click on the button here, we can see the bubble factor with different players at the table. So hero is going to be on the left side. So when you're the small blind in this spot, your bubble factor versus the button is actually 2.28, which makes sense. So if we go here with the button and we say the button shoves, we can see that for the big blind, who has the smaller stack, the bubble factor is 1.7, and the bubble factor for the small blind is larger. Now, obviously, the small blind is calling off more chips, so it's getting a bit worse of a price. But still, you are obviously going to be be able to call less hands in this spot as the small blind because you're sitting second or third, and only 2 people are going to get paid. So the fact that there's this 1,000 chip stack at the table means that you have to be very cautious. And as we can see here, even though the button is going to be jamming 74% of the time, the small blind can only call with 9s plus. And every other hand is losing. Ace-king offsuit is an atrocious punt. Even though our opponent is jamming all of these hands, including all of these offsuit aces and all these suited aces that we would just absolutely crush with ace-king, we still have to fold it because of ICM. Again, just looking at this little chart that pops up, I think it's a super handy tool. This is one of the reasons that I recommend ICMizer because of this bubble chart or this bubble factor table. All right, so we get a little sidetracked with the bubble factor stuff there. But the reason we pulled this up was that I wanted to demonstrate the idea of ICM priority. And in this exact spot, I wanted to demonstrate it for the big blind. So we're going to say hero is actually the big blind in this spot. We can just say that the small blind's gone all in here. And if we look over here at the EV flow button, you click that and you see that at the beginning of this hand, the big blind had an EV of 19.17. If you have like a piece of paper or something, I want you to write that down. 19.17 for the big blind. Now, if the big blind calls and wins this all in versus the small blind, what's going to happen is the small blind is now going to have 500 chips. The big blind is going to have 2,000. And what we do is just sort of ICMize it again and take a look at the EV flows. So we went from 19-ish% equity in the big blind to having 36.67% in this case when we double up through the small blind, who had 1,500 chips or 15 big blinds to begin. Now let's reset this situation, but let's change who's in the small blind. So the guy who was in the small blind is now on the button. The button, who's the chip leader, is now going to be in the small blind, and the big blind is going to have 10 big blinds again. So we just double check our EV to make sure that it's the same. Again, we see that, again, it doesn't matter. The stack size at the table and the payout structure are the only inputs we need for like solving for the equity of the stacks. So we can see that all of these EVs are still the same for all the players, even though they're in different positions. Now we can see in this spot that immediately that the small blind is jamming. I'll change this to make it a little more consistent. Small blind is jamming any 2 cards in this spot, even though we are the shortest stack at the table. And even though in the previous spot, our opponent was jamming something like 64%, 70%, and we called something like 40%, now our opponent's jamming even more cards, and we are calling like half the range that we were calling before. And again, it's because we don't really want to collide with with the small blind here. We want to collide with the button, and the button is going to be who we have the ICM priority with in the spot. And the reason that we're going to see that's the case is, let's say we did end up calling this. We had one of these 23% hands. We called, we doubled. So now we have a stack of 2,000 chips. Small blind has gone down to 4,000. Again, we still have the same amount of chips on the table, 7,500 chips. We're just going to run this spot like this. So we started the hand with 19% equity of the prize pool. So again, the prize pool was 65% first, 35% second. We started with 19%. In the previous example, we doubled through the 1,500 stack blind versus blind, and we then ended up with 36% equity, which is even greater than second place equity in that spot. In this spot, though, when we double through the chip leader blind versus blind, what we see is our equity goes from 19% to 30%, which is like a dramatic difference. We make about 10% equity in the prize pool, doubling through the small blind in that spot when the chip leader is small blind. In the previous spot, we were almost doubling our equity in the tournament. So the easiest way to sort of see this is I created a table to have everything in one spot. So as we can see here on the left, this is just the equity of the different players in the tournament, the equity of their stacks with the different 50, 15, and 10 big blinds over there on the left. Up here in scenario number 1 was the first scenario we looked at when the button was a chip leader. Small blind had 15 big blinds, big blind had 10 big blinds. The big blind doubled, and we went from 19.17% equity in the tournament to 36.67, which is a 17.5% increase. So again, we almost doubled our equity. Conversely, the small blind went from 28% down to 9%. And as we can see in scenario number 2 here, this was when the small blind was the chip leader, jamming any 2 cards. We called like 23% of the time, so we called significantly less, and we doubled through them. And in that spot, we saw our equity go from 19.17 to 30.33, which is a difference of 11% in the tournament, and which is dramatically different than the spot we saw prior, where we were colliding with a stack that was similar to our own. And the whole idea of showing this example is that it sort of demonstrates this idea of ICM priority and how, like, even though in both cases we doubled and we ended up with the same amount of chips in both cases, because we doubled through the stack that was closer to our own in the first example, we gained a lot more of the prize pool as a result of the fact that in the first example, small blind now only has 5 big blinds left, versus in scenario number 2, we end up in a spot where we have 20, button's still pretty close to us with 15. Small blind still has a clear chip lead, but it's not wrapped up or anything that they're going to win this tournament for sure. And as a result, we end up being in a spot where we don't gain as much equity from the prize pool, even though we ended up winning the same amount of chips. And obviously, like, we didn't talk about this, but if we lose to either of those players in the all ends, it doesn't matter. Our EV is 0 in the tournament. We busted, we bubbled. So hopefully that was a good example for illustrating like exactly why ICM priority is important and sort of exactly what it is and situations where it's important. The third concept we're going to touch on that hopefully helps you to sort of better gain insight into why results that you're seeing in your ICM calculator look the way they do is the idea of collision potential. So it's a term I personally use to help account for the likelihood of stacks colliding behind me after I fold. Tends to play a factor in spots that see hero playing less hands than expected in a given spot. We're going to demonstrate that in ICMizer in a second. And in general, the more likely players are to collide behind after you fold, the more plus dollar EV your fold. So unlike in a spot that's pure chip EV, where clearly if you fold, you're not making chips, you can fold and have it make money in an ICM scenario, which I don't know if many people know that or if many people watching this course know that, but it is the case. All right, so what I've done here is set up another 6-max bubble spot. This is a spot that is legitimately a spot that I found myself in one time. I was actually railing Tonka, play on Twitch, and he had a spot where he passed on a spot like this, and I thought it was just a clear shove with a ton of your range. And I was kind of shocked he made a fold he did, and I was like, that's got to be wrong. Haha, he's so bad. I checked it. He was right. I was wrong. I suck. And now I'm making a course on intro to sit and goes. But anyways, what happened here was hero had about 20 big blinds on the button. Small blind had 10 big blinds. Big blind had 10 big blinds. What I thought was going to happen is that on the direct bubble, again, 65% payout to first, 35% to second. No one gets any money for third. I'm like, oh, I just get to jam here. ICM super heavy. I'm getting a good price. They can never call. So if we just take a look at this, again, I ran this with FGS. Spoilers right there. So what's happening in this spot is that hero actually only ends up being able to jam 30%. And I thought this was like some sort of mistake. I was missing something. And I couldn't really grasp why that would be the case, especially if you look at the calling ranges here, small blind, if I jam, can call this range of 6.6% of hands, and big blind can call 6.9% of hands. So I'm like, okay, I'm getting a good price. How am I only jamming? They're never calling. How am I only jamming 31% of the time? And the reason that I'm only jamming 31% of the time here is because when I fold as the button, what happens is the small blind's going to jam 75% of the time, and the big blind is going to call 31% of the time. So 22, 23, 24% of the time after I fold, there's going to be a collision blind versus blind between the two 10 big blind stacks. And what's either going to happen is one person is going to be absolutely crippled, or two, fold as the button. What happens is the small blind is going to jam 75% of the time, and the big blind is going to call 31% of the time. So 22, 23, 24% of the time after I fold, there's going to be a collision blind versus blind between the two 10 big blind stacks. And what's either going to happen is one person is going to be absolutely crippled, or two, someone's going to bust. And what happens is the small blind is going to jam 75% of the time, and the big blind is going to call 31% of the time. So 22, 23, 24% of the time after I fold, there's going to be a collision blind versus blind between the two 10 big blind stacks. And what's either going to happen is one person is going to be absolutely crippled, or two, someone's going to bust, and we're going to immediately realize that 35% equity that you get for second place. So that collision potential in this spot, what happens after I fold on the button, is so good for my equity in the tournament that I allow that to happen a decent amount of the time. Even though I'm presented with like a really profitable shove on the button in terms of chips, it's a lot better for my tournament EV, for my dollar EV in the tournament, if I allow the hand to more frequently get to the small blind. So I don't feel as compelled to be like, oh, I'm just going to punish this spot, because just picking up that 180 chips X% of the time, colliding, getting it in quite bad the other like times I get called, whatever that is, like 10% of the time or so, it's not as valuable to me as it is allowing the hand to get to this node where small blind jams a ton of their hands and big blind calls off very frequently. And then they bust, and we realize their equity, and that is how, that's sort of like a great example, in my opinion, of collision potential and how it impacts strategy, and how a lot of results where where you're probably the chip leader and you think you're going to get to plow people over, but you are forced to like play a tighter range than you think. It ends up being because of stuff like this, where the collision potential of the players behind you is just worth a lot more to your EV in the tournament than you picking up this pot a bunch of the time uncontested. And then the last concept we're going to talk about today is this idea of equity protection. And this is something that I really harp with the people that I've coached on ICM. And it's more of a general mantra of mine. And it's something that I think that you should be constantly mindful of in-game. And it's something I try to be constantly mindful of in-game. And it's basically just that, in my experience, two things are true when it comes to ICM. One, you almost always have more equity than you think you do, especially as the short stack. And two, people are terrible at estimating and thereby appreciating the equity of their stack. And it's not an easy thing to do, and I can't like blame them for it. It's not a very intuitive thing, just naturally as a byproduct of the way that like tournaments and sit and goes have their payout structures, with the fact that they're not winner take all. With this like sliding scale payout structure, it isn't easy to intuit how much equity your stack's worth. And equity protection is something that is especially important in recreational heavy player pools. Now, in terms of like why it's especially important in recreational heavy player pools, that's because recreationals are going to be bad at estimating their stack and are therefore going to make more mistakes. They're going to get it in more than they should. And when people are like throwing chips around in spots they shouldn't and getting it in and busting in spots they shouldn't, those are all things that are going to help add EV to our folds and are going to like encourage us to play tighter, because our stack actually has more equity than a calculator is telling us it does. And one thing I want to go back and like highlight again, because it's sort of going to serve as like a preface for the illustrated part of this concept that's going to come in a second. This idea of having more equity than you think you do when you're the short stack, I think it's tied in with entitlement. I think like people's appreciation for their equity at a tournament correlates with how much entitlement they feel. So like they feel more entitlement when they have a big stack, and they can sort of naturally grasp that their stack has a lot of equity. But there's this dissonance or this disconnect when people are short stacked. They think they're free rolling, you know, like if you're in the money, for example, and you're the short stack, they feel like well, they've already locked up the bottom spot, or they're here to play for the win, or like whatever. They ignore the fact that their stack is worth a certain amount of money, and they should be like considering that a lot more than they do. The number of times that I've heard someone say something like, they're short stack in a spot and they make a really thin call off or bad call off or a bad shove. And I'm like, okay, that clearly doesn't make money. And they're like, oh, well, like, I'm the short stack. ICM doesn't apply to me anymore. Or, like, I'm here to win. Like, no, that's just like, those are just like such terrible ways to think about poker. Your stack is worth a certain amount of money, and you are trying to play every single hand at every single decision node as profitably as you can. And what they did is straight up lose money. Like, they could have just went and lit $20 or $50 or $100 or way more than that some fire, and it would have been the exact same thing to what they just did in that spot. And what I really want you guys to take away from this slide, arguably this is the most important slide of the entire lesson, and it is that you almost always have more equity in your stack than you think you do when you're in a sit and go, especially an MTT sit and go or an MTT. So to sort of demonstrate this concept, again, we're going to turn to ICMizer. All right, everyone, welcome back. So what I've done here is I haven't run this yet. And what I've done is set up a 5-handed spot in a on-demand sit and go on like America's Card Room or Black Chip Poker, whatever skin you play on. We can see over here that the payouts are 40% for first, 23% for second, 16% for third, 12% for fourth, and 9% for fifth. So Hero's going to be under the gun here with 10 big blinds. Cutoff is going to have 20 big blinds. Button is going to have 30. Small blind has 15, and big blind has 25. So this would be a spot to me where I think that most people are like, I'm the clear short stack at the table. ICM isn't really much of an effect on me anymore. I don't have that much equity in the tournament. It doesn't really matter what happens to me at this point. And what I think is going to happen here is that I'm going to hit this ICMize button. I'm going to check the EVs, and we're going to have a lot more EV than just 9% of the prize pool. So let us do that and find out. That felt quick. So just push fold would be about 17% of hands in this spot. I think that seems reasonable. I think that on average, most people would mostly find this. Maybe they'd even be a little bit tighter than this. But yeah, let's check the EVs. As you can see here, the EV of the under the gun player in this spot is 15.45%. And again, if we look over here at the payout structure, we see that under the gun has almost third place equity in this spot. So this actually highlights exactly what I was talking about. And it is this idea that even in a spot where you were the clear chip leader and you're in the money, and this is a pretty top heavy payout structure with 40% of the prize pool going to first place, it is still the case that you probably have more equity than you think you do. And as a result of that, you need to protect that equity. You cannot just treat it as if you're free rolling at this point and just be like, play pure chip EV or something like that. Things are going to happen in this tournament that are good for you. For example, you could fold and there could be a collision behind you. Someone busts, you ladder. That's awesome. You had 15% equity and now you're guaranteed 12%. And you probably have a bit more than 15 now that someone's busted. In addition to this, something that could happen is you go all in with a hand that is a $+ EV shove. Someone calls, you double. Now you've got 20 bigs in this spot, and now 20s of like, it doesn't matter who you double through. 20 big blinds is going to put you at a decent amount of equity. But yeah, there's like just a lot of good things that can happen, and just because you're dead last doesn't mean you're out of it. Now, if we have 10 big blinds and everyone else at the table has 100, yeah, sure, we probably don't have that much EV. But in a spot like this, these stacks are all very much within touching distance. And as a result of that, our EV is actually substantial in this spot. And our stack's worth a lot of money, and we should play it responsibly. So yeah, we talked a bit about, I'm trying to think of like the concepts that we talked about today. We talked about bubble factor. We talked about ICM priority. We talked about collision potential. And then we just demonstrated the idea of equity protection. And I think that when you are going through your ICM calculator answers, and you're trying to understand what's happening, maybe an answer comes out that you don't quite understand, there's a good chance one or more of these concepts that we talked about today are the reason. So yeah, that's sort of like the general intro to the ICM module. And in the next lesson, we are going to go into the first two sort of like strategic big picture concepts that are applicable to most ICM formats or most sit and go formats. So I'll see you guys then.
He's a fucking love bug piece of shit.
Hey guys, how are you? Welcome back. And welcome to the first of a 4-part mini-series that's going to take us right through to the end of module number 4. It's entitled Fundamental ICM Concepts, and it's sort of something I came up with when I ran into the issue of not really knowing how to approach the ICM intensive part of this course. The thing about a general intro to sit and go course is that there are a lot of different sit and go formats that you guys could be choosing to pursue after you're done with this course. And I wanted to do it justice, and I didn't want to just take like a 6-max sit and go ICM as a baseline and use that as a framework for this entire ICM section. And as a result, I came up with this brainchild, this fundamental ICM concepts thing, where every lesson for the next 4 lessons, I'm going to talk about 1 or 2 sort of like all-encompassing, overarching ICM related concepts, strategic related concepts that I either learned through my study, were sort of like light bulb moments in my sit and go career. I'm going to talk a little bit about some pool exploits that is going to help you guys in your games make a bit more money. I'm going to talk about some mistakes that I commonly see in low mid-stake sit and goes, and sort of like why I think those mistakes are happening and why they're mistakes. And hopefully you can avoid those. And yeah, that's basically the gist of what I want to do with this mini series. In terms of how I've structured each individual lesson, we're going to talk about like whatever the fundamental is. Then we're going to talk about the strategic implications of that fundamental. And then finally, we're going to go into ICMizer, and we're going to go through a couple of examples, ideally with a couple of different ICM formats, to sort of illustrate whatever concept or whatever fundamental I was talking about. And that's sort of the gist of what we're going to be doing for the next 4 videos here. And hopefully, arguably, this is going to be the part of the course that you take the most out of. So let's just jump right into that. All right, so ICM fundamental number 1, use the sit and goes payout structure to inform your strategy. I think that a lot of people have this idea that ICM is sort of like consistent, universal across like formats, whatever they're playing. Obviously, there are some exceptions like a 50-50 or a double or nothing or whatever. Clearly, that is going to be different from a traditional 9-man sit and go. But I think if you take something like we have on this page here, when people look at a payout structure like this, they just sort of think that, you know, ICM is something that applies to both of these formats. And it's like, yes, that's true. But the payout structure and exactly how it's organized has an effect on the sort of like strategy that we are incentivized to be playing with different stack sizes within like a certain distribution of stacks. So if I'm playing a sit and go, we have on the left here an 18-man sit and go payout structure, and on the right a 5-paid on-demand sit and go payout structure. If I am playing one of these, the first thing that I'm going to be doing is looking at the payout structure, more specifically the percent of the prize pool, the percent of PP here, and I'm paying attention to how much of the prize pool is being awarded with each jump. more specifically the difference between the places, how much the prize pool's jumping. So in the example of the 18-man sit and go on the left, it's 4 paid. Fourth is going to get 10%, and then you go up 10% to get 20% here. In third, go up another 10% to get second, and then you go up another 10% to get 40% in first. That's why I mentioned earlier, and I've mentioned a few times in this course, that 18-man sit and goes are basically the epitome of a flat payout structure. You have the same difference in the prize pool, percent of prize pool being awarded with each interval. 10% of the prize pool is being awarded with every bust. While if you look over here on the right at the more traditional top-heavy format, you have 5 people being paid. Fifth gets 9% of the prize pool. Fourth gets 12%. Third gets 16%. So we've went up by 3%, then 4%. And then in second, we're going to jump up 7% of the prize pool. And then in first, you go up 17% of the prize pool. So for people who are wondering sort of like what the difference is between when people say a payout structure is flat and a payout structure is top heavy, this is what they're talking about. It's really about the difference in the percent of the prize pool being awarded with each concurrent jump or each subsequent jump. So in the flat payout structure, what tends to happen is that percent of the prize pool being awarded with each bust, it tends to be a similar percent of the prize pool. So in the case of the 18-man sit and go, it's literally 10% of the prize pool being awarded with each ladder. Conversely, in the top-heavy structure, what's happening is you tend to have like these smaller intervals at the bottom of the payout structure once you get into money. And then a lot of, it's not as obvious here as both of these formats, 40% of the prize pool is being awarded to first place. But if you think of what a tournament structure looks like, or maybe a 180-man sit and go, or even a 45-man sit and go, where 7 people are paid, that interval's smaller as you get in the money, the first few payouts, and then it starts to get larger as you get towards the third, second place, first place, and with the biggest jump coming from second to first. So in terms of something, a word I use often is incentives. So in a flat payout structure, in this one, in the 18-man sit and go on the left here, you aren't really incentivized to win the tournament. There's no big bonus for winning the tournament. Like, yes, you win the most amount of money, but really the priority is on protecting the equity you do have. What you do tend to have is more equity on average in an 18-man or in a flat payout structure versus a top-heavy one. And because you have more equity on average, you have to protect that equity. And so laddering, especially when you're a middling or short stack, becomes sort of your priority. That's how you're going to obtain the highest ROI in that format, by sort of protecting your equity in that sort of environment. Meanwhile, in a top-heavy payout structure, what sort of happens is, and it's kind of cool, it's kind of like 2 phases. So at the beginning, once you get into the money and you have these like flat payout structures at the bottom, the ICM tends to be a bit heavier. And it's a bit heavier because, you can't just immediately go from 5th place to first place and win the tournament, right? But at the same time, obviously, there is a bit of a bonus for sure at the top for winning the sit and go. So we are going to make the most money by finishing first as frequently as possible. That said, at the beginning of a beginning of the end of money stage, you tend to be protecting your equity more. You tend to be playing a bit, I don't want to say tighter because that's not true, but the ICM's heavier. The bubble factor is going to be larger. And it's really about getting those ladders in at the beginning. The ICM isn't as strict at that stage as it is in something like an 18-man sit and go, but it's still probably a bit more strict than you would think it is. And then eventually, as we move up the ladder and people bust, we hit an inflection point, I'll call it. And that is when the ICM becomes dramatically less strict, and it becomes about accumulating chips and getting first place as often as you can in that spot. Like, you're not taking negative EV plays or anything, but basically like the chip EV premium that you have in a heavy ICM, where you need like 65%, 70% equity to call off jams in a spot you would normally at chip EV need like 48% or something. That sort of dramatically relaxes, and you end up needing maybe more like 55%, which makes sense because you want to win the sit and go more frequently. You want to accumulate chips, and we're no longer in a position where we just want to ladder. We want to ultimately win this thing. Okay, so I've touched on a lot of this already, but in terms of the strategic implications of flat payout structures and top-heavy ones, for flat payout structures, stacks tend to have more equity on average throughout the in-the-money stage, and therefore less incentive to outright win the sit-and-go. Again, that doesn't mean we don't want to win the sit-and-go. That'd be great. It's just that that's not necessarily our number one priority. Our number one priority is protecting your equity, and laddering becomes prioritized over winning the sit-and-go more frequently. That is how you are going to have the highest ROI in these flat payout structure formats like 18 minutes. Subsequently, because these things are the case, because bubble factors are so high, because we are incentivized to ladder, because these, like, especially middling stacks end up in absolute ICM hell, this ends up a very lucrative spot for big stacks. Chips should just flow to these big stacks. In general, ICM, one of the reasons why this ICM model is like set up over time is because it gives extra value, or it awards extra value to big stacks. And that's reflective of what happens in practice. When you're the big stack at an ICM spot, you tend to be able to open more, you tend to be able to raise fold a little bit more, you tend to be able to 3-bet fold more, basically just leverage your stack. And just apply a lot of pressure to the other stacks at the table that don't want to bust because you are constantly threatening the fact that could happen. So what happens in a very flat payout structure is you end up being able to open even more than you would in a top heavy, and you end up being able to 3-bet fold more often, and you end up being able to raise fold more often. And when your opponents reship versus your opens, you need to be doing that because they need to be making a certain amount of money or a certain amount of chips to make their play profitable. So it's completely fine that you raise the button and you fold it to that 15 big blind reship 80% of the time with your range, because that person, your opponent, needed to have a very profitable reship for them to make money with that reship, with like the worst hand they'd reship. Hopefully that makes sense. I think it does. And that's why it should be a lucrative spot, but that's why the little asterisk is there at the end, is that a lot of people, especially in my experience in 18-mans, they don't appreciate how heavy the ICM is at 4-handed play and 3-handed play once you get in the money. They do on the bubble, of course. Like people are able to sort of intuit that, it's all about cashing. You're not getting any money right now, but once you ladder one more spot, you're going to get money. And therefore I need to be tight, or I need to be careful not to bust here. But people don't appreciate how heavy the ICM is once you get in the money of a flat payout structure. And if people are not appreciating that, if they're calling off your shoves too wide, if they are playing back at you too much, all of a sudden your opens and your raise folds and your 3-bet folds and stuff like that, they aren't making the money that they should be making. And what's going to happen is if people are colliding like they're going to, more frequently than they should, a lot more frequently, and they're calling off jams too wide, etc., what you're incentivized to do in a spot like that or an environment like that is just tighten up dramatically as the big stack. Even if it feels really bad, that is how you are going to make the most money in that format. So you do have to be careful. If you feel like someone's a good regular and they are respecting ICM and they're aware of that ICM being heavy in that spot, then great, like play like you think you should be playing. But if you're just playing your average opponent and you know how heavy the ICM is and you're pretty sure they don't, you should probably make some adjustments in the direction of playing a bit more snug than you would be playing at equilibrium. And additionally, in terms of this like lucrative spot for big stacks, you probably have, if you look at the payout, if you look at Shark Scope at like the payout distribution graph, which is a really useful little feature for a lot of the best 18-man sit and go regulars, what you tend to see is they have their, like if you look at first through fifth place finishes, their bubble finish is like the place they finish in the least often, which makes sense. And it tends to go like they finish first most often, then second most often, third most often, fourth, and then bubble. But they end up having like this high concentration of finishes in the sort of like 8th through 11th region. And that's at the point where I think there's a lot of value in, I don't want to say gambling, but I want to say taking some thinner spots that maybe an ICM calculator would tell you is negative EV in the hopes of building a stack. Because if you end up getting to the bubble more often with a big stack, it's a very profitable spot to find yourself. Chips are just going to flow to you. So I think that a lot of very good players sort of take that 8 through 11 players remaining spot and try to build that stack and arrive to the bubble more frequently with the big stack. And again, in theory, what should happen is if you're on the bubble and you're in the money with the big stack, chips should be flowing to you. You should be making a lot of money in that spot. Another thing that happens in flat payout structures a lot, especially in structures where you end up on 10 to 20 big blinds on average, like these turbo formats, is that play ends up very push fold heavy. People can't raise call as wide for value, therefore they can't do as much raise folding, and just they can't do as much opening in general. And as a result, people just end up playing very push fold heavy, and that's the best way for them to realize their equity too. So moving on to the strategic implications of top heavy payout structures, I think it's good to sort of like use the previous slide as a reference point or a baseline when we think of like comparing what we do now in top heavy structures, since the flat structure we're sort of doing the opposite and we're incentivized to do the opposite. So top heavy payout structures, what we talk about here is going to be especially relevant to MTT sit and goes. This tends to be how on demands are structured, their payout structures, 45 mans, 180 mans, etc. We're going to talk a little bit about 45 mans in the ICMizer section. They're kind of cool because they are especially flat once you get in the money, but then they're top heavy at the very end. In the money, play tends to begin with relatively flat payouts, like I just mentioned with the 45 man, which results in higher bubble factors before reaching an inflection point, as I mentioned in the slide where we did the comparison between the 18 man and the on demand, where the ICM eases and relaxes, and the bubble factors as a result decrease. So relative to a flat payout structure, there's less inherent value associated with being the big stack in the money once the bubble bursts. And this should make sense because the ICM is a bit less restrictive. People don't have to have that. Their risk premium, their chip EV risk premium isn't as high for them in terms of that threshold for making a plus dollar EV play. It's not as high. And as a result, they can play back a little bit more. They can reship a little bit lighter, et cetera, et cetera. And lower bubble factors leads to a bit less emphasis on push full play relative to flat payout structures. If you can raise call wider for value, you're going to have more value hands in that range where you're opening not all in, because some of those hands that in a flat payout structure, you would like stronger hands like pocket nines or ace king offsuit or ace queen offsuit, because some of those hands are going into your raise call range now. They can't go into your shoving range because you don't have those strong hands. You can't jam as wide as you were in the flat payout structure because your range isn't as protected, it's weaker. Therefore you need, or because you don't have those hands protecting that range, you end up not being able to shove as many weaker bottom of range fringier holdings. All right, so moving on to the ICMizer part of today's lesson, sort of some things I'd like you to keep in mind as we go through this. What I'm going to do is do a comparison of the payout structures we looked at before, the 18-man versus the 5 paid on demand. We're going to be focusing a lot on the bubble factors, how they're changing as less players are remaining in the sit and go, how they compare not just within the same sit and go, but across the formats. And I think the best way of sort of visualizing how heavy or how relaxed the ICM is in a spot is going to be to focus on what is happening blind versus blind, how wide small blind's able to jam, and conversely how wide or how tight the big blind's allowed to call off. The way I have set these up is I have basically 10 big blind stacks. I don't want this one actually. I have basically 10 big blind stacks set up for everyone. This is the 18-man. Again, the payouts are 40, 30, 20, 10. Everyone's got 10 big blinds, and I am going to run this and try to take a look at what the bubble factors are. This is going to be on the bubble of an 18-man, 4 paid, 5 left. I expect there will be super heavy ICM in this spot. We can see the bubble factors are massive. They're all orange and red here on the table. Again, I think this is part of why ICMizer is awesome, and I highly recommend you guys to be using it at least at the beginning on your sit and go foray. This is good. I wish I had had this back in my day. It would have made studying a lot more efficient. But we can see the bubble factors are between like 1.65 and 2.3, which is wild, or 2.34, which is super high. That basically means that in this spot where the button is facing a 10 big blind jam from the under the gun player here, the button needs 70% plus equity to make a plus dollar EV call off. I'm actually kind of curious at what that calling range is. Yeah, so under the gun's able to jam 40% of hands, and the button can only call off 10s, ace queen suited, ace king offsuit profitably. So even though it's a 10 big blind jam, you have to fold 9s, you have to fold 8s. 8s are atrocious, obviously, if they're not calling 9s. Ace queen offsuit, pure fold in that spot. But yeah, all the bubble factors super high, makes sense. It's on the bubble. Blind versus blind, clearly. It's kind of interesting, actually. You have an any 2 card jam, and not only is it an any 2 card jam with everyone on 10 big blinds, but 7 deuce offsuit is making 1.20% of the prize pool, which is massive. And the big blind is only able to call off, even though this is the lowest bubble factor at the table. The big blind still needs 62% equity to call off versus any 2 cards here to make a plus dollar EV call off.
Fuck me.
And they end up only being able to call 6-6, ace-10, ace-jack offsuit, king-queen suited, which is pretty wild to me. But obviously I knew that and it made sense because I played 18. Hands back in the day. Paying attention to how the bubble factors shift as we get in the money here in the 18 man. Again, this is something that's probably going to be surprising to people. In this spot, the small blind can still jam any 2 cards profitably, and 7 deuce offsuit is still absolutely minting as a shove. And the big blind, even though we're in the money now, can still only call 6-6, a7, 10, king 10 suited, king queen offsuit, because the ICM is that heavy still in the money of an 18 man. Again, you are incentivized to protect your equity, to ladder. You just don't really want to be the one calling off. It's very lucrative for you to be the one doing the shoving in these spots. At least in equilibrium. Again, in practice, people are not going to call off this tight if they have no idea how tight they need to be. And that actually ends up kind of disastrous. I can show you what that would look like. If I had to guess, an average player gets in the money of a sit and go, faces a jam here. I would say they're calling at least this range. Let's calculate this. So you were able to profitably jam any 2 cards. They were minting before. Now you're down to only being able to profitably jam 35% of hands as a small blind. Again, this is why, like, in these spots where if you know someone's making a mistake in a certain direction, you can adjust and make money, a lot more money in return. So you just end up having to fold a lot or do a lot of limping, for example, with hands that you would think should be very profitable jams. Looking at the bubble factors four-handed, obviously still very high. 1.5 through almost 2. Big blind needs 61% equity to make a plus EV call off. That sort of explains why the big blind could only profitably call off 12% there. As we move to 3-handed, I'm going to do 5 FGS here. Bubble factors still high. Small blind still able to jam 81% of hands. Big blind's only calling 20% of hands. Again, we only have 10 big blinds at the table, everyone. Bubble factors are between 1.4 and 1.6 at this point, which is just super heavy. And hopefully that sort of drives home exactly why flat payout structures incentivize this equity protection and like laddering. Let's do, so with that in mind, let's take a look at the on-demand. All right, so what's happening here in the on-demand again, 10 big blinds for every player. We just got in the money of this tournament. So looking at the payout structure, 40, 23, 16, 12, 9, pretty flat at the bottom, becoming very top heavy at the top. So we expect what I expect will be some heavier bubble factors, 5-handed especially, and then greatly relaxing as we get 3-handed. And 3-handed is probably going to be like basically the inflection point where we go from super clearly going from, protecting our equity a bit more to being like, we want to win this thing. So running the FGS, we see that in this spot in the money, Small blind's able to jam 88% of hands. Hands like 5-3 offsuit, 8-4 offsuit, 7-4 offsuit, 10-3 offsuit are making money as jams, and the big blind's calling 23%. So again, this is already like greatly relaxed from the 18-man. If we look at the calling range, that feels like pretty reasonable to like what someone would maybe hit in practice in a spot like this, where they're like, okay, you're facing like some random faces a spot where everyone has the same stack. You just got in the money. You're facing a small blind jam, and you're like I'll call this range. So I think that like intuitively people get to about where they're supposed to get here. If we look at the bubble factors, they're all between like 1.3 and 1.7. So again, like some people in the spot, button facing a jam from under the gun, for example, still needs 63% to make a profitable call in the spot. That is going to result in a call of nines, ace jack, ace queen. If we move on to four-handed play, bubble factors have started to relax a little for sure. 1.3 to about 1.5 for everyone at the table. Small blind is able to jam 81%. Big blind calls a little bit wider here, 24. And then three-handed, this for sure is where we're going to see the most relaxed ICM, with these payouts looking like they are, with that massive second to first place jump. Just a lot of value in winning this sit and go. And we see our first green bubble factor of the day so far. Big blind, blind versus blind needs 54.8% to make a plus EV call. Again, it's not like you're playing pure chip EV or anything, but small blind's able to jam 67% profitably, and big blind calls off 27% of hands. And the bubble factors are all between about 1.2 and 1.35. So definitely the least restrictive ICM we have seen so far in this top-heavy payout structure. And one more thing I wanted to just sort of quickly go through to sort of drive home this idea of this inflection point is, and I think I know for sure in this 45 man, it's going to be a lot more clear. I want to just 45 mans, by the way, especially at low stakes, very like awesome games. Highly recommend if you want to like start with 45 mans. Great games, very soft and good ICM for learning like some some smaller entrance sit and goes, as well as like 180 mans, MTT, stuff like that. As we can see here, the payout structure kind of unique in that, and something that people definitely underestimate is how heavy the ICM is just inside the money of a 45 man. It's very flat. So we can see 7th to 6th, 2.5% difference in prize pool, 6th to 5th, 3%, 5th to 4th, 3.5%, 4th to 3rd, 4%, 3rd to 2nd, 5%, still like pretty flat. And then you have the big jump at the end. 2nd to 1st is like 9.5%. So the incentive or the inflection point is definitely going to come at the end, probably three-handed. And it's really flat early, and it's going to be a lot of spots happening blind versus blind where it's going to be like any 2-card jam for small blind, and big blind can't really call that much. So let's just take a look here. I'm not going to run this with FGS. It's going to take way too long. But I just want to like really quickly go through the bubble factors. Compare like the smallest bubble factor to the highest. Again, this is in the money, 7-handed. We can see massive across the board 1.9 bubble factor. I didn't run this FGS. That's why it's all static. But yeah, any 2-card jam, and big blind can only call 17% of hands. Just want to run these really quickly and just pay attention to the numbers on the left here for the bubble factor. 1.8, still super high, 6-handed. .7, 5-handed. Should 1.6. I'm going to start running some FGS here. I expect this to be significantly less. Yeah, 1.3, 1.4. So still heavier than we saw in the on-demand, but by far the least restrictive ICM. Small blind is now jamming 71%, and the big blind's able to call 25%. But yeah, I would argue that that's clearly the inflection point of the sit and go. I'll just run this just in case with an FGS, just to make sure I've covered my bases forehanded. Yeah, ICM's more restrictive for sure, forehanded there. But yeah, hopefully this has been illuminating. Hopefully you are able to see the difference between a flat payout structure and a more top heavy one, and hopefully you are able to like sort of more intuitively understand how our strategies should differ depending on the format we're playing, and sort of like what we're incentivized to try to accomplish in each format. So I will see you guys next time when we talk about two of the more costly bubble mistakes that a player can make in sit and goes.
Shower. Shit. I gotta wash damn clothes today. Damn it. Joe Rogan Podcast, check it out.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night, all day.
Well, what's happening, man? Pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
It's always so odd when you've seen someone in so many movies and you meet him in real life. You're like, real person. You know? It's strange, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I do have that same thing myself. When I meet somebody that whose work I dig or whatever, I'm still just the same fan that I was, before I even got into the business. I met Daniel Day-Lewis in a Motel 8 in Conestoga, New York State. A guy saw us and he said, you know, do you mind if I take your photograph? So we went out into the car park of this Motel 8, and this guy took a photograph, and about, I don't know, 7 or 8 months later, a copy of it arrived in my house in Australia, and the guy had basically just, you know, written Russell Crowe, Australia, and sent it to me. So I have a copy of it, and it's a funny thing, you know, it's like I was there, it was the Boxing Hall of Fame. I was there with Angelo Dundee, and he was there with Barry McGuigan. Yeah. There you go.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It was just unexpected, and, you know, it was a cool thing. He was such a nice fella, too.
Daniel Day-Lewis is a real legend because he's one of those guys just like disappears for a couple of years and makes shoes.
Yeah.
Just a real artist.
Just quirky stuff, and then suddenly comes back with a vengeance and a fury.
Yeah.
And you go, oh my God, look at that. Yeah.
Yeah, he's...
But, you know, some of us have to work for a living, mate. You know, he's probably got independent wealth.
Well, he's just a different kind of human, you know? Any guy who can just walk away like that and just decide to make shoes, like that's the real deal.
Oh, it's pretty special.
Some people try to pretend to be quirky, you know? They try to pretend to be eccentric, and then there's the real
thing.
There's
the actual eccentrics.
Yeah, the actual eccentrics are so fascinating to me. And yeah, for a guy like, you know, to meet a guy like that, he's one of those odd ones. But you are too. It's like, it's always, it's interesting to hear from a person that is a guy like you that still feels weird to meet people that are, you know, that you've admired their work. I always feel the same way, and I always feel like this is gonna go away. And then I'm like, nope, Russell Crowe. Oh wow! I met Dennis Quaid the other day. Same thing. It's like, oh, it's Dennis Quaid.
Cool.
Just seems so strange.
Cool. Yeah, if I was to explain to my, you know, childhood self, my 10-year-old self, what was in front of me, and the people that I would meet, and the things that I would experience, and the contacts that you know have come along in my life, it just, my little brain would have just exploded. There's just no way I could have possibly imagined that this life was going to unfold in front of me.
How could you? I mean, you'd have to be so ambitious. You'd have to have the most crazy expectations possible.
Yeah, and I would, you know, my first thing when I was leaving school is that just don't have a boring life. Just don't, you know, find some way of like being able to express yourself, you know. My first job out of school, my first official job, was working for an insurance company, Commercial Union Insurance, inputting the details of policies.
Oof. So not off to a great start.
Oh, man. But it was a funny thing, though, because I learned, you know, a lot in my short time there. In the summer before, I'd worked as a nightclub DJ, and I got fired because I couldn't talk. I was too nervous to talk on the microphone.
Wow.
So after like 5 or 6 weeks, they shuffled me off, you know, and the guy really, you know, dug what I was playing and how I got the dance floor moving and everything. But, you know, he says, you know, I need to sell toasted sandwiches, man. You have to tell people that the kitchen's open, you know. So, you know, I left school partway through the last year. You know, in New Zealand, they have a different thing where you have a bursary year after normal high school finishes. And in your bursary year, if you achieve to a certain degree, you get money towards your university degree, you know. But it was clear to me in that last year, my dad was out of work, and I wasn't going to be able to go to university. We couldn't afford that sort of thing, you know. It only would have cost, you know, $3,500 or $4,000 or something like that back in the day. But that was beyond our means as a family. And I started working at this insurance company, and I was the only person in the building of a big insurance company who had actually passed matriculation into university. You know, and the general manager of the company, you know, sat me down to tell me that one day. You know, you're the only person with, you know, the higher school certificate, what they call university entrance in New Zealand, in the building, you know. And I just watched this thing unfold. The coolest dude in the building was this salesman, right? And he had a beard and he wore kind of cool sunglasses and everything. And I remember the day he bought a new pair of shoes. And all the girls in the building, oh, have you seen whatever his name is, new shoes? And they were all fluttering over him and stuff like that. And this guy was the best salesman they had and blah, 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 you know. And in the time that I was there.
Hey guys, how are you? Welcome back. And welcome to the first of a 4-part mini-series. Hey everyone, welcome to lesson number 3 of our Navigating ICM Heavy Spots module. Today, as you can see on the screen, we are going to talk about respecting the money bubble. And we also have our second ICM fundamental today, and it is thou shalt protect thy stack's equity on the money bubble. And this is something I think people do very poorly. That's part of why it's a lesson in this course. So why calling off on the money bubble is so unappealing? Well, first things first, bubbling a sit and go, bubbling an MTT, it's disastrous. Those min caches, securing those caches when you are close to the bubble is just absolutely vital for win rate. And bubble factors are at their highest on the money bubble for a reason, or for a few reasons. Most stacks on the money bubble have reasonable equity. You're one place away from getting paid. You're probably, especially in a sit and go, going to be quite close to the end of the sit and go. And as a result of that, you're close to the biggest payout jumps. And as a result of that, your stack tends to have a decent amount of equity. And I would argue, and I'm very confident about this, that most people underestimate exactly how much money their stack is worth in these spots. And that is sort of exhibited through their neglect for heeding caution when it comes to the risk of bubbling, or being aware of how bad bubbling is. So calling off in a spot where you're facing a shove, especially when you're covered, obviously, results in a guaranteed showdown. Like you do not, it's not like shoving where you shove and sometimes you just pick up the blinds uncontested. Every time you call off a shove, you are 100% of the time going to showdown versus at least one player. If you're not calling off the big blind, there's a risk of you going to showdown with multiple players, and the overcall range is just going to absolutely crush both the shover and us. But yeah, calling off results in a guaranteed showdown and a relatively high bust percentage. Like even against a range, unless you have like Queens Plus, or not even Queens Plus, like Kings Plus, you're going to bust probably like greater than 30% of the time in that spot. And that means you frequently get to realize 0% of your stack's equity, which, as I just mentioned, tends to be, a reasonable amount of equity. So sort of similar to the fact that different hands, different ranges in poker, we were always talking about equity realization. Something similar is going on in this spot when it comes to realizing the equity of your stack.
Go get the thing.
Car.
Also worth noting that doubling our stack in this spot does not result in doubling our stack's equity, just as a byproduct of how tournaments work. That's why we have ICM. If it was just a linear model, if it was a winner take all, then we wouldn't have ICM. But because we have a payout structure and we are trying to figure out or trying to estimate the value of our chips within this payout structure and relative to everyone else's stack in the tournament, what ends up happening is that, let's say you're in a spot where you have 20% equity and you call off and you lose. Well, you bubble and now you get 0%. Your stack's worth 0. You have no stack, it's worth 0%. You get $0 and you bubble. Conversely, if you double in that spot, what tends to happen is the bubble's still going. You did not secure the min cash at that point. But also, while you just lost 20% equity if you call and lose, you're not going to gain 20% equity if you call and win. More than likely, you are going to have something more like 30% equity. So there's a big difference in what you gain when you win versus what you lose when you lose. And then finally, I'd note that if you look at SharkScope, one of the pretty cool things you can do is when you create an alias, as we talked way back in module number 1, you can look at the finish distribution graphs for your alias of like good regulars, for example, in a specific format of sit and go. And what I've found, looking at 18-man rags and 6-man rags and 45-man rags back in the day, is that if you look at, like, for example, a 6-max, 2 places paid. If you look at the payout or the finishing distributions for like the best players in terms of like first, second, and third, how frequently they get those positions, the third place is the lowest of those 3. Usually it goes first place they get most often, second place they get second most often, and they bubble the least frequent. Conversely, if you look at 18-man sit and go regs, what you tend to see is that 4 people get paid, and fifth bubbles, and the fifth place finishes for the best regs is their lowest frequency finish of those 5 positions. And again, similar to the six packs, the best players tend to finish first more than they finish second, more than they finish third, more than they finish fourth, more than they finish fifth. And what I think that this sort of highlights is, one, obviously in a bubble when ICM is this heavy, it pays to be the big stack. And if you more frequently arrive to the bubble with a big stack, you are able to more frequently accumulate chips. And if you're more frequently accumulating chips on the bubble, what tends to happen is you win the sit and go more often. And if we look at the fact that they have the lowest frequency finish for the bubble position, to me, that just suggests that they're very aware, those players are very aware of how important caching is in those spots. And they're minimizing the mistakes they're making in that spot by doing something like calling off too wide. All right, so what we have here is I created a little bubble factor reference chart for you guys. The sort of like conditions are that for every spot, I did it with whatever number of players, cash +1. I did it 10 big blind stacks for everyone, and I did not run FGS because what was going to end up happening was something like a 6-man would get a full orbit or 2 orbits of FGS. Meanwhile, a 45-man would get none because an orbit of FGS in that spot is just too many hands to sim through. It's to take too long on the computer. And also, it's not really going to be that reflective because people are going to play poorly, and this just assumes everyone plays Nash push fold in future hands. But yeah, so as you can see here, the big thing that stands out to me is that it doesn't really matter what format you're playing, with the exception of, I guess, maybe 6 max. The bubble factor on the bubble is just really heavy. It's basically 2. Which means that in this spot where everyone has 10 big blinds, you need about 66.7% equity versus the shoving range to make a plus $1 EV call. And that's just to make, like, if your hand has 67% equity, then you are barely making any money. In terms of why I think the 6 max has the such like a dramatically different bubble factor, just to be clear, like I say it's dramatically different, but we're talking about a spot where you probably in Chippy V need 45% on average to profitably call off. And you can only call off if you have a hand that has 60% equity versus the shoving range. So you need like a 33% plus premium in that spot to make a plus $1 EV call over a plus Chippy V call. So it's still very restrictive. But something that's going to happen in 6 max is there's 3 people left on the bubble. And if you call off and knock someone out, what's going to happen is you're likely going to be heads up with the chip lead, which means you're going to get first place more often. And you're immediately going to get the chance to get first place more often because you're going to be heads up and there's only 2 people left. And you're going to have the chip lead. So that's going to result in you getting that 65%, that extra 30% of the prize pool more often than, for example, say if you're playing a 5 paid on demand or an 18-man sit and go. When you get in the money, you're still 4 or 5 players left, where at a 6 max you're heads up. And one last thing I would like to mention about what we're seeing on the screen here is, again, I think I can't overstate this enough, or I can't overstate this. The 18-man is the epitome of a flat payout structure, as we learned in the previous lesson, and a 5 paid on demand is basically the epitome of a top-heavy structure. 40% of the prize pool goes to first, despite 5 people being paid. And both of those formats, in this case, have the exact same bubble factor on the bubble. So, yeah, the fact that... I think what that sort of highlights is that it doesn't matter necessarily what format you're playing, with the exception of 6 max, obviously. MTT or sit and go, just caching is so important. And it's probably underestimated by the player pool on average, especially in a sit and go where people are like, oh, there's not that much money up top. There's only 3 people paid or 4 people paid. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to make some very thin, what I think is thin, but it's actually terrible, call off in the spot where I bust a huge percentage of the time. So strategic implications of basically everything we've discussed so far. This is not going to be shocking, but you're generally forced to call off shoves very narrow on the money bubble, especially when you're covered. Or as I put here, especially when stacks are closely distributed and or hero is neither the short stack nor calling off the short stack. Because in that spot, You're either in the first one, in the former one, you're going to have the least amount of equity to protect at the table. But you're still going to be calling off pretty tight. Let's be clear. We're going to see that in the ICMizer section. Or you're going to be calling off the short stack, which means you cover them, which means you can't bust. Very few hands maximize their EV raise calling off on the bubble versus just outright open shoving. We're going to take a look at that as well. And this sort of makes sense because, again, if let's say you're raise calling off and you're covered, it's the exact same thing. You're guaranteed to go to showdown. You're guaranteed to bust a big percentage of the time. So you need a the bar in terms of, or the threshold in terms of the strength of the value hand you need to raise call is just very high. And my sort of tip as you go through these ICMizer sims and just in general in sit and goes when you find yourself in these spots is to stay continuously mindful of the concept of ICM priority that we talked about in lesson 1 of module 4. It's just really important knowing or sort of prioritizing who you're colliding with and knowing who should collide